Welcome to Shrinks Who Drink with Amita Ghosh. This monthly podcast dives into special topics in mental health, exploring themes like motivation, anxiety, trauma, and depression. Each episode is designed to engage, inform, and inspire as we journey together toward the incredible India Therapists Retreat in October 2025. Join us for candid conversations with expert guests, sharing their lived experiences and professional insights. And don't miss the wisdom-packed closing segment, where we hear from therapists you'll meet at the retreat. Let's spill some tea, share some stories, and build a stronger mental health community, one episode at a time. Your host, Amita Ghosh, is a passionate mental health advocate and professional dedicated to fostering meaningful discussions around mental wellness. With a knack for storytelling and a love for connecting with others, Amita brings warmth, insight, and a touch of humor to every episode. Get ready to explore deep topics, hear unique perspectives, and gain practical advice as Amita leads the way to our shared destination, the incredible India Therapists Retreat in October 2025. Now let's get started.
All right, so here we have Dr. Bruce Chalmer, and he is a 30-year veteran in the mental health field. He is coming to us from Vermont, and he is currently promoting his last book, and I'm going to let him talk more about all of that. But I am super, super excited to have Dr. Chalmer here with us and to learn all about his work and the things that he is written about in his books and advice that he can give us with his 30-year experience. So here we go. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me on. I'm honored to be in the early part of your podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, your history, your path. How did you get here?
Sure. Well, you mentioned I've been doing this for 30 years. I am not a young person. I am in my 70s. So the implication there is I didn't start like right out of college getting into this. I actually had a career as a statistician for a while. I had got a master's degree in statistics, working in some very psychological areas. And the more I got into it and various things happening in my own life, I got much more interested in doing clinical work. I got a PhD in psychology and then got clinical training after that. I got the PhD was in the research side of things. And I really got into, doing therapy with folks. And some of my early internships were in for a mental health, community mental health place in Vermont that also worked with couples and families. And so I got more and more into couples therapy. So over the course of my 30 years in private practice, I've been specializing more and more in couples. So the last few years, pretty much everybody I accept as new folks have been couples. And I just love the work. There's something about it. It's a privilege to be led into a couple's life that way. It doesn't feel like a job. It feels like a calling, that it feels like this is helping to repair the world to do this. And so I'm honored to be allowed to help people that way. It's really inspiring to me.
Sure. So tell us a little bit about your practice right now. Mm-hmm. And also about your upcoming book. And then we'll talk more about your sort of philosophy and what you believe makes couples therapy work. And, what are some of the things that you mentioned that what you learn from your therapist is not right, that communication is not the key. So I want to know more about that.
Yes, indeed. Yes, you're alluding to, I've had 3 books that have come out in the last 5 years. And you were talking about the second one there, so I'll come back around to that.
Okay.
But what I'm doing now, it's all telehealth since the pandemic, actually. A couple of months into the pandemic, I commented to my wife, I said, I really like this telehealth thing. I mean, I don't like the pandemic, but I like the telehealth thing. And so I just kept doing it that way, and it seems to work very well for folks. The books that I've written, the first book that came out just in time for the pandemic, actually I'll hold it up. It's called Reigniting the Spark. Whoops. Like stable relationships. Yeah.
That's beautiful graphics on it. Yes.
Yes, I owe that to the publisher. They had some good folks designing beautiful. It. Why stable relationships lose intimacy and how to get it back. And this book is based on some stuff that I had formulated. You talk about sort of my philosophy of doing the work, some ideas I'd formulated many, many years ago. In fact, I love to tell the origin story of this. And I even have this on a cup. The podcast my wife and I do is called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. Well, those are the 7 words.
Be kind, don't panic, and have faith.
Exactly, yeah. You have to count the and to get 7. 7's a better number than 6. Right. And where did that come from? Well, early on in my practice, 2-3 years in, I imagine, so we're probably talking about 27 years ago or something, I was in a consultation group with colleagues, as we often do, and that's a good thing to do. And we had been talking about couples therapy, I think. I don't even remember actually what we were talking about, but probably couples therapy, because as we were leaving, literally walking out the door, a colleague of mine turned to me and said, "How do you do couples therapy anyway?" It's sort of like I could answer that,
Yeah.
And I said, well, I actually have sometimes thought about it. I sort of boiled it down. I suppose if you look at all the various techniques we've learned and ways of thinking about it, basically what I'm trying to convey to people is be kind and don't panic. That's just 5 words. Be kind and don't panic. Because if the kind doesn't just mean being nice, it means recognize your kinship. Recognize that, you're in this together. You're part of the same tribe, So when couples recognize their kinship, that's when things tend to go better. So you can't do that when you're in a panic. So that's why be kind and don't panic. And many of the techniques we learned about how to help people, in a conversation are about getting past the panic or avoiding the panic.
Yeah.
So I shared that with some of the folks I work with. I said, well, gee, they would say, that's really interesting. I really like that. And then they would say, okay, how do you not panic? There's the key. There's the rub. How do you not panic? And so what I recognized was, if I don't have a simple answer to that, frankly, how do you not panic? But what I noticed was the couples that seemed to not panic were the ones who manifested a mindset, which I call faith. And I know people use the word faith a lot of different ways, and I don't necessarily mean it in a religious sense. Faith is that basic, the way I'm using the word, faith is the mindset that says, even when it's painful, even when it's a mess, even when I don't understand what's going on and I wish it weren't, still, there's something right about this whole existence business. When you accept that reality, even when it's hard, is right to be what it is. The couples that manifested that were the ones who could get past the panic. They were the ones, they'll come in with, all kinds of really painful stuff. Well, you're in the field as well, of course. They'll come in with lots of painful stuff. I'm guessing maybe half of the couples I work with are dealing with infidelity. It seems like it's very, very common, or other kinds of betrayal. That was the 3rd book I wrote about. I'll talk about it in a bit. But they would come in with these hard things, and the couples that would say, we wish this hadn't happened. It's really painful, but we're going to have to understand this better because it's the only way we'll know what to do. That's manifesting faith. The couples that would come in and say, oh my God, we just want to go back to how it was before. You can't go back to how it was before. And that's kind of the opposite of faith. They're just refusing to accept that what happened.
The reality of things. Yeah.
Yeah. And the rightness too. That's the faith part. Not just not just sort of gritting your teeth and say, "Oh, life's a bitch," and then you die. Not that.
Yeah.
It's more like, wow, it's hard sometimes, but there's some meaning there. There's something important about it. That's the sense where I mean faith. So that first book, Reigniting the Spark, was oriented around those 7 words. I just said, the 3 principles: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And then let's learn from that.
I'd love to read that book because, I know that I have a lot of couples that not necessarily dealing with infidelity, but definitely dealing with a sense of disconnect from each other.
Absolutely.
And, a lot of it comes from when you start having children, you're busy with your work, you're busy with other things, that you start to drift away just because you're doing life. And life takes a lot of energy out of you.
Well, that's exactly the subtitle of that book, how stable couples lose intimacy and how to get it back. Why stable couples lose intimacy. That's exactly what you're describing. When people, have kids, set up a life together, they will prize intimacy. They will prize stability over intimacy. And that's one of the things I almost always talk about with couples in the first session. Couples need both stability and intimacy, and yet the skills you need for those 2 things are somewhat in conflict. stability is all about avoiding anxiety for good reason.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's what
Yeah.
that makes sense. But intimacy is about tolerating anxiety.
Well,
Intimacy,
yeah, intimacy is about excitement. It's about
Yes.
adventure. And when you have a lot of stability, the adventure seems to kind of go down a little
That's
bit.
right.
And that's where people get kind of stagnant and what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word right now, but you know, basically not try.
Yes, exactly. Because what'll happen is they will be afraid, understandably, be afraid of rocking the boat too much. You know, to bring up with your partner, first of all, something as simple as a complaint, you know, just a simple complaint. It's like, hey, I wish you wouldn't do X, Y, or Z that you're doing or something. You know that's going to raise anxiety. So a lot of times people will just not do that, and then it'll sit there and fester and it'll get worse. Or even not in the complaint department, something about a fantasy, either in the sexual domain or just more generally. It's like, wow, I've been thinking I want to go live somewhere else for 6 months together as a family. Could we, you know, and you're worried you're going to freak out your partner, so you don't say it or you suppress it. When you suppress intimacy, that itself becomes destabilizing. That's kind of
and
the
you know,
thesis.
I have an interesting example for you right there. So I don't know if you've read my bio, but I used to be a flight attendant when I was still living in India.
I didn't see that. Wow,
Yeah,
I saw
used
that
to
you'd grown up in
travel
India,
all over
but
the
yeah.
world.
Wow.
And so, you know, travel is in my blood. And my father was a Navy person, even in his younger days. So, I mean, I have it in my genetics. So the latest obsession I have is with Venice, because we went to Italy a few years ago and I am absolutely in love with Venice. So I've been reading all these books about Venice. And so my husband, on the other hand, is somebody who really prizes stability. And so in the beginning of our marriage, I would say, oh my God, you know, I want to go live here. And he would go into panic. Like, you know, are we selling our house and moving? And, you know, I had to kind of we had to work together to figure out that's just fantasy for me. I mean, you know, I'm not stupid. I'm not going to sell my house and move to Venice tomorrow. But it is nice to be able to talk about those things.
Yeah.
You know, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. But maybe we'll go stay there for a month and that will be enough. You know, I'll be like, okay, I'm tired of walking in the water all day. But, you know, and it'll be fine. But I think the panic piece is very important because we naturally get attracted to people who are so different from us.
Of course.
And so that, of course, when we are attracted initially, it's wonderful. But then later on, we're like, why aren't you more like me? You know, and so it's like, I'm wanting to go live in Venice, and my husband's like, oh, I want to mow the yard over here, you know. So
making room for that without panic is really the basis of intimacy of all kinds.
Right.
And so that first book was all about that process. It's like, oh, no wonder stable, you know, you don't have to be crazy, evil, or stupid for this to happen. These are normal processes for regular old people. And that first book was about that. The second one you did allude to, and I'll hold up that one as well. This is the one with the snarky title.
Yeah.
It's not about communication, why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong. Now, where do I get off saying that? You know, it's like, is that arrogant or what? You know? Where do I get off?
Would the Gottmans come after you for that?
Well, you know, they certainly could. And actually, I've quoted, you know, the Gottmans in several of my books very approvingly. So it's like, no, I mean, maybe they would. I'll explain where that title came from and the subtitle too. What I've noted is that people, of course, I mean, people come into therapy and in the first session, I've never counted, but I'm guessing it's like 80% of the time the word communication comes up early in the session. You know, people are saying what's going on and they will often say, well, we need to communicate better. Every time we try to talk about something, if it's at all controversial, we end up in a fight or we end up in a deep freeze or some combination of that. We need tools to communicate. That's what they're there to do. And you can find, of course, if you look at the vast array of therapeutic modalities out there, there's a zillion different, and self-help books and everything else, there's a zillion different books on, here's some communication techniques you should learn to use. And I note in the book, in my humble opinion, not very humble, I guess, all of those ideas are good ideas. like nonviolent communication, great set of ideas. The idea of iMessages rather than you messages, people have heard of that one. Great set of ideas. The idea of active listening, make sure you understand what the other person said. All good ideas. In fact, all of those things are things that you will notice a well-functioning couple does. If you talk about John Gottman's work, when he looks at his videotapes, the couples that are doing well 20 years later, the newlyweds who are doing well 20 years later, are the ones who were more or less implementing those techniques, maybe not formally, but they were listening to each other, and they weren't insulting each other, and they were stating things in terms of what they want rather than accusing the other person of wrongdoing. His 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling. They're not doing those things, the couples that do well. The fallacy comes up when people then say, well, if well-functioning couples communicate that way, if we teach people to communicate that way, they'll be well-functioning. That's baloney. That turns out not to be true. And even Gottman, I quote Gottman in that book actually, noting himself that just because couples that do well are behaving a certain way doesn't mean that's why they're behaving a certain way. That's a fallacy. I'm enough of a nerd to quote it to name the fallacy in Latin. Not that I'm a Latin scholar, but that is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which means after, therefore, because of. It's confusing causation with correlation.
Okay.
So what I'm saying, the reason I'm saying it's not about communication is the vast majority of couples I work with are actually very skilled at communicating. They may not think so, but they're very skilled at communicating. It's not that they're not communicating clearly. The problem isn't that they don't know how to communicate. Now, there's a few exceptions. Every once in a while, you meet somebody, for example, on the autistic spectrum, where they don't know how to read their partner's emotions or something. Yeah, that causes communication problems. It's like, whoa, there's total misunderstanding happening there.
I want to ask you something. So I have been dealing with some couples where they're not diagnosed, neurodivergent, but almost.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's kind of like they're very highly functional, doing very well professionally and all that stuff. But there's just this kind of inability to read, empathize, understand the partner's emotions.
Yeah, and that is.
You have that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's not that common. That diagnosis, the ASD diagnosis, is becoming way more common, mostly because it is being looked for now, and the definition has expanded. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's interesting. I've noted there's a lot more of that. But most of the folks I work with, even folks who maybe, it's funny, just recently I've met a couple of people who got that diagnosis as adults. And it's been useful for them to varying degrees. Sometimes the diagnosis can be useful, and sometimes it can be a straitjacket.
Right.
It's if people think,
or then an excuse.
Or an excuse, or whatever. But most of the folks I work with, that's not the issue. The issue isn't that they're not communicating clearly. The issue is what they are communicating clearly. What they're communicating is distrust, anger, contempt, all sorts of things that don't work very well with their partner, and their partner is communicating back whatever they're communicating, which tends to be really nasty stuff. So the problem isn't about teaching them how to convey those things more clearly. They're already being very clear. You can craft I statements, as opposed to you statements, and you can be every bit as nasty and critical and contemptuous with an I statement as you can with you statement if you're clever. And most people are pretty clever, It's the techniques don't work if what's underneath it, if the meaning underneath it isn't there.
It's got to be deeper than just the verbiage.
And moreover, if you don't need it, if a couple is doing well, then those techniques are ridiculous. They're just ridiculous. I'm blessed to say I have a wonderful marriage with my wife, and neither one of us wants to sit there and say, now what I understand you to be saying is this. Unless, if it comes up naturally, that's what I'm saying. A well-functioning couple will do things that look like that, but they won't sit there and consciously insist on following the technique. And the problem is when a couple isn't functioning well, they won't be able to follow the technique. They'll just argue about it.
Right.
And if you
Oh,
really,
yeah. Argue about you didn't follow the technique.
Yes,
I
yes.
did. And oh my goodness.
Now it's
I've heard couples come in and say, Amita told us to do this.
That's right. Oh my God. Oh yeah. Or my therapist and your therapist.
Wait a second. The point is this, not to follow it word for word, but
exactly.
Yeah.
And actually it interferes with intimacy in some ways because you don't know where the conversation's going to go. And again, if the couple's in a panic, it won't work. And the part of your brain, all of our brains, they do this in the studies they've done with functional MRI scanners. When you get into panic mode, much of the neocortex shuts down. It's just not available for a good evolutionary reason. It's like, it protects us. But then you're not going to think of those things. So learning the techniques tends to mostly, again, I don't want to overstate it, mostly is a waste of time. Now, I have to address the subtitle of that book, the snarky subtitle, Why Everything You Know About Couple Therapy is Wrong. I do note, spoiler alert, I note in one of the last chapters of the book, by the way, that subtitle applies to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong also. Now, where do I get off saying that? It's like, come on, I've just written a book and I'm telling you in one of the last chapters, don't listen to anything I've said. No, I don't mean that. What I mean is the problem is the word to know something. If I think I've got the last word on couples therapy, that's ridiculous. So I've just given all these ideas about how I think, learning communications techniques is probably a waste of time. Yeah, except when it isn't. So that's not the last word, but I think that's some useful ideas. And the problem happens when we as therapists, and we are all prone to this, I think, when we click into our favorite techniques and we turn them not ideas, but ideologies. We harden them into ideologies. Like, I have to fit everything I hear through the particular filter that I learned in my most recent training, That tends to not be helpful. That tends to be harmful. What happens when ideas harden into ideologies is they become caricatures. You see this in the political domain. I guess you were a political science major, right?
Yes, I was.
I heard that part. Yes,
undergrad. Yes.
Yeah, you see that in the political domain when ideas, because there can be all kinds of interesting and often conflicting ideas that generate new ideas, and it's like, wow, I hadn't thought of that. When people are not having an idea conversation, when they're having an ideological conversation, it's not a conversation. They're just basically shouting at each other, and they're both hardening their positions rather than opening them. Yeah. And therapy can do that.
I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of a stretch, and this is because of my sort of angle of what I am trying to bring up in the podcast. So,
sure.
I grew up in India and I was very much exposed to the Indian culture, the philosophy and things like that. And I have to be honest, I did not study it, in India. All of my education in Hinduism, Buddhism, all the philosophies has been since I came here. But living and growing up there, it was just, you can't avoid it. You just sort of absorb it just by being there. So I wonder how you see bringing kind of the Eastern beliefs or ideas with the Western idea of psychology. Have you ever seen that happen? Have you ever done that yourself?
Yes.
And in what way do you see that can be married together?
Oh, absolutely, I have. And it's interesting, what you said about, you didn't study it till you got away from it.
Yes.
But you were immersed in it. You grew up in it. It's part of who you are. Yeah, I, of course, did not grow up in India, so I wasn't immersed in it. I ended up learning and I don't even want to dignify it by saying studied it. I don't feel like I'm an expert in any way, but I certainly learned a fair amount. Well, actually, my undergraduate major was East Asian Studies.
Oh, okay.
And mostly Japanese and some Chinese. And along the way, it wasn't just East Asia. I also learned some stuff about South Asia. And I really was fascinated by especially Buddhist ideas.
Yes.
That I still find incredibly useful. And one of the things I love about just the fact of introducing a worldview that's so different from what I grew up with, it's just the fact of that difference. It's the fact that, the stuff we think we assume, the stuff we assume without realizing it, not everybody assumes the same way. Do you know Jonathan Haidt's work? Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. The book I'm referring to especially, he's written a number of books that I really like, but the one I'm referring to is called The Righteous Mind. He's a psychologist who studied what he calls moral foundations theory.
Okay.
And he has amazing examples in that book, some of them from India actually, about things that from a person who grew up in this country's perspective, it's like, wow, that's weird. Except that it isn't weird if you understand it on the basis of saying there are different ways of viewing these various moral foundations. And if this is where you're starting from, no wonder that's what you conclude. Right. And it's a way of opening up perspective. Couples therapy, especially, I think any therapy, but especially couples therapy, is all about opening up perspectives. So to introduce ideas that you didn't grow up with, or ideas that are, it's interesting. People don't always assume what you're assuming. Just to question those assumptions, to raise them, opens people up. It's often uncomfortable because it's like, how can anybody think that? And then you realize millions upon millions of people think that. They're not all crazy. It can't be true that, you see the same thing in the political divide, It can't be true that whatever half you're in, the other half is crazy. It can't be true.
Yeah.
There's crazies all over, there's crazies on both sides, but it can't be true that most people are crazy. Otherwise, I don't know what crazy means.
Right, right.
So there's got to be some way of understanding that. So getting more specifically, one of the Buddhist ideas I love to note, even the way in which Buddhism raises the question about self. It's like we think we have this individual self. And I'm sure this is undoubtedly, I'll bet you know a lot more about it than I do. I'll bet this is a sort of almost absurd characterization, but I always like to think to myself or occasionally point out, the problem of death that Western religions handle by talking about an afterlife, Buddhism handles by saying, well, you don't have to worry about death. What makes you think you're alive? It's like this whole individual self thing. We're all, the silly joke about what did the Buddhists say to the hot dog vendor? Do you know that
I
one?
don't know.
Oh, make me one with everything.
Oh, right, right.
Yes, right. Yes. It's that sense that we're all in this same universe. It's all one big universe, and this artificial distinction of saying we're all separate selves is actually an illusion, and clinging to that is the source of suffering. That's my, oversimplified, I'm sure, understanding of a lot of what Buddhism has to say. And that's incredibly helpful stuff, I think. Yeah. Yes. And understanding just the fact of opening up other perspectives is really important. And that, that's important in therapy. And of course, I can maybe segue to my most recent book. It's important in healing from betrayal as well.
Yes.
The idea that it's possible to view what you don't know how to view any other way than it's just horrible and evil and wrong. There are multiple ways of viewing that again, without having to suspend your sense of morality, there are ways of viewing that can lead you to heal.
Yeah.
And I find that a really helpful thing. Does that address what you're wondering about?
Yes, absolutely. As far as the betrayal piece goes, I read Esther Perel's book, State of Affairs.
Yes, so did I. Yeah.
And one of the things that really stuck with me was when she was talking about the difference in culture in the context of having an affair in a marriage. Mm-hmm. And she said, in France, the person who has been betrayed would be angry that you didn't care about them enough to hide their affair well enough.
Yes.
And in the US, people are angry that you lied to them.
Yes.
And I mean, to me, it's like that is so profound.
Yeah.
And such a big difference in culture, even in the Western world.
Yes.
They're both Western cultures, but there's that difference of, in France, they'd be like, well, if you really cared about me, you'd be hiding it really well.
Yeah, you'd have been a better liar.
Right.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it is very different. And again, it's springing from different assumptions and different understandings of the meaning of going and having sex with someone you're not married to.
Right.
And, it is fascinating, those differences. So for people to, it's one of the, let me hold up that book too since I'm holding up my books here. This is that most recent one. Whoops, Betrayal and Forgiveness: How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. And what I address in there, actually, one of the first questions I invite people to do. I mean, when you're in shock, it's hard to do any of these things, but once you get past the initial shock, really look and see, okay, do you absolutely have to consider this betrayal? Because in some contexts, that's not always so clear. You know, there's lots, I've met over the years, well, thousands of couples, and over the years, and this is almost always women who feel this way, although I can't think of exceptions to that. Maybe there are some. If the guy looks at porn, there are plenty of women who think of that as betrayal. Yeah. Or it feels like cheating, and, you know, for various reasons. I was working with a couple where that had come up. And I mean, lots of couples it's come up about porn, and, you know, do they consider it betrayal or not? A lot of times people are able, you know, the woman in those cases are able to come around and say, well, I don't have to, I can think of it as distasteful. I can think of it as something I thoroughly disapprove of. I don't have to think of it as betrayal in the same way. Other people would say, no, it's betrayal. It's like, no, you know, he hid it. He lied about it. That's, you know, that it's like the lying itself is a betrayal. You know, of course, the guy's lying about it because he knows that she'll go through the roof if she hears about it. And it's so interesting. I hadn't thought, I read Estelle Perel's, both of her books actually as well. I'd forgotten about that one. It's like, in France it would be just be a better, you know, hide it better. What's the matter with you? If you really cared about me, you know, that's great. Yeah. So, but that question often is, does it really have to be considered betrayal? Now, most of the folks I work with, that's unambiguous. It's like, come on, we've promised each other sexual monogamy, and you went and had sex with somebody else. That's clearly betrayal in most people's understanding, at least in our culture. So that would be, then it's a matter of figuring out, all right, how do you get past that? And I say getting past that, when I talk about forgiveness, and of course, forgiveness, people use the term a couple of different ways. I have my favorite way of using it, and there's a way a lot of people use it. A lot of people, when they say somebody forgives, that means they restore the relationship. And I don't mean that. You can forgive somebody you have no intention of restoring the relationship with. You can forgive somebody you have no trust in at all. I tell a story in my book about a woman I met a long time ago, I never met her ex-husband because he was in prison. And why was he in prison? Because he had been horribly violent to her and their children. She finally was able to escape that, and it was hard to do, but she managed to do it. And she told me, when I met her, she was coming to see me about some other stuff, and she said she forgave her ex-husband. She had nothing to do with him. She kept a restraining order active. There was no way she was ever going to be in his presence if she could avoid it. But she let go of the anger. She figured, well, he's crazy. I mean, he was a dangerous guy, and he was crazy, and for whatever reason, she knew he wasn't safe, but she could forgive him. She wasn't carrying around the poison herself.
So there is a saying in Buddhism, and it says that when you resent somebody, it is like you're holding a burning piece of coal in your hand with the intention of throwing it at that person.
Yes.
Who is getting burned.
Exactly. Yes. You know, there's another quote I actually include in the book from Anne Lamott. She's a novelist. Yeah. And her quote, I got the words exact, but basically she says, to not forgive is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. Exactly the same idea, right?
Yes,
and I point out, if you can get the poison out of you, then you can think about the rat. You're still dealing with a rat, but at least you can think about it then. So yes, that's
Bruce, I'm going to ask you to do two things before we end today. One is my audience is both clients and therapists. So I want you to give one thing that clients can take away from this, and then one thing that therapists can take away from this.
Great. Well, for clients, you know, that 7-word formula I came up with is kind of the key. And you have to understand what it all means, but be kind, don't panic, and have faith. That's the challenge. That's the work. It's not easy, but I think that clarifies it. Be kind so that you can recognize your kinship. And the way to do that is to not panic. And that involves practicing, and I emphasize practicing, that concept of faith. And it is a practice. It's not a knowledge. It's not something you can read in a book. It's something you have to practice. So that's for clients. And for therapists, of course, I'm going to say the same thing. It's, if we don't manifest that same faith in working with our clients, we're not going to help them much. We can give them some good ideas, but I think that one of the main things the therapist offers in any sort of therapy, regardless of what kind of, modality you're talking about, is faith in themselves and their clients. In other words, that basic sense that says, yeah, this is doable. We don't know how it's going to turn out. I don't know with couples, are they going to stay together or not? But there's something about this whole life business that's doable. And so I can hold that for the clients even when they can't.
Yeah.
So it's the same idea. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith.
I'm going to ask you one more question.
Sure.
Since you have been doing this for 30 some years, I know that there are clinicians who experience burnout.
Yes.
And so what is your secret to not getting burned out?
Yeah, I thought about that a lot, because what I find is when I am working well. Now, what does it mean when I'm working well? When I'm working well, it's when I'm not feeling burned out. It's when I'm feeling energized by the work rather than exhausted by it. When I'm working well, it's because I'm not trying to sell people something they don't want to buy. And that's really all about my recognition. And I think this is a deeply held value. I do not claim to know better than my clients how they should live their lives. I really don't. And when I start thinking I do, that's when I get frustrated. Because that's when people are going to, the concept in therapy of resistance. I don't deal with resistance because I'm not trying to push them anywhere. I'm really trying to work with them collaboratively. And when I'm working collaboratively, I don't burn out. It just feels like a privilege. I get energized. I get ideas. Now, I'm not saying it's easy work, as you know. It can be painful or difficult. But that's the secret to me in burnout is that really experiencing them work as meaningful. And it's really about faith. It's really about that sense of, wow, this whole existence business is complicated, isn't it? But there's something really important about it and something meaningful. Read Viktor Frankl, when his experiences in Auschwitz, you could find meaning even in suffering. That's the antidote to burnout. So that's basically how I think of it.
That's wonderful. How do you take care of yourself?
In the way I just described, sort of, I love the meaning.
I'm talking about outside.
In other ways, I do.
I see a keyboard behind you. So do you play music?
I play and actually compose music, and I sing, and I direct choirs, and I also sing in choral groups, and so that's a lot of what I do. And, my wife and I like to do a lot of stuff together as well. And that's really a huge part of my life as well. And, one of the nice things about being at the part of my career I'm in, which is, I'm in my 70s now, I have wound down the number of hours I work somewhat. So it's left me room to do other stuff. And the podcast that my wife and I do, we have a blast doing that. So all of those fit into self-care for me.
Can you tell us about the podcast, what it's called and where it's hosted? Where can people see it? Or hear it?
Yeah, here's the merch again. We have it on a cup. We have it on tote bags. Not that anybody buys these things, but we do have it. Couples Therapy in 7 Words. You can get it anywhere you get podcasts. So all of the major podcast platforms have it. And or you can go to my website, which is brucechalmer.com. That's also where you can find out about me and my books and my practice. And we have a podcast website, which is CT in 7, like Couples Therapy in 7 Words, ctin7.com, the number 7. ctin7.com will also get you all the information about our podcast as well.
And I will include all that information when I post this podcast as well.
Great.
Any other last words before we end?
Just thank you for doing this. And again, I'm honored to be on. I guess this is one of your first podcasts. I guess it's
you
the
are.
Intro. I am.
Yeah.
It's just really, I am honored, and I look forward to your podcasts going forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me and being my guest. And I am really looking forward to hearing more about your podcast and your books. And thank you very much.
Thank you.